Hi, welcome to the Midterm Evaluation for CS5610 by Timothy Yim. First, we're going to go over everything that we have learned in class. I'm going to show you a basic map of how a web application works. First, we have a client. A client is connecting to the server, and on the server, we have our full web development stack. We have the different backend, front end, database, and all the different things that we're using to generate the content client side. Client side, we have HTML, CSS, and JavaScript that's running in the browser. Client side, that is the only thing that is running, and that is all that is needed to render content for people to use, look at, and interact with. Server side, we can have different web stacks. For example, in our class, we are using Node.js, Express.js, MongoDB, and React. Express and MongoDB and Node.js are essentially what's running the backend of the server, MongoDB being the database, and React being the front-end library to be able to generate content client-side. React is able to take care of the front-end rendering, data, and other interactivity. Node.js and Express work together to run the backend. It can be the routing, the API, and connections to the database. And MongoDB is the database that we use. It is using a binary JSON and is able to be very flexible and robust in storing a lot of data and fetching a lot of data very quickly. Now, all of these things can be run server side that the client is basically accessing. When a client requests a URL, Express is able to route that URL to the correct pages, both on the back end and what is going to be eventually served on the front end. And then, if needed, Express can also connect using the MongoDB driver to connect to the database. And if we're using a front-end library, it's able to run all the JavaScript and things like that to be able to go between the client and the server. When the client is connecting, it doesn't see anything in the server. It doesn't see anything in the database. It is only getting the HTML, CSS, and JavaScript directly and rendering what it sees on the web browser. There are many different web stacks. Node.js isn't the only thing that can be used. For example, you can use a Linux server and run an Apache server that handles all the routing and things like that. React isn't the only front-end library. You can use Vue, you can use Django, you can use AngularJS. There are many different options and many different stacks. For databases, you don't need to use MongoDB. But for simplicity, MongoDB is probably the most flexible, but you can always use MySQL, SQLite, Postgres, and all sorts of different databases. Each database has its pros and cons, and your mileage may vary in terms of what you use and what you need in terms of its capabilities for your web application. The same goes for the backend. On the server, whatever you need needs to be determined for the purpose and scope of your project. And so whatever fits your needs the best is probably the best that you need to look through to find the best that you need to use. Client side, we have to remember that everything that runs needs to be able to run on all web browsers. There are 3 big web engines: the Chromium web engine, the Safari WebKit, and then the Firefox engine. It's best to be able to check all three of those browsers to be able to make sure that the content you want rendered is actually rendered properly on all three browsers. Not all three browsers support all the JavaScript, HTML tags, and things like that. So it's best to, as a programming best practice, to be able to look at all of those browsers and see if what's being rendered is being rendered correctly. Next, I'm going to give you a different mental map of a web application, and specifically a web application that we are learning in our class. And I'm going to go over the broad descriptions and the high-level concepts for each one of these things. So, as the name suggests, a web application is kind of like a web, represented here. At its core, we have HTML. HTML is basically the building blueprints or the bones of a website. Basically, HTML is built with different tags. Each tag is a different type of thing. For example, an A tag is a link, a div is a content block, a button, and so on and so forth. HTML also has the header, footer, and all the other information and metadata that's built into the web application. So different metadatas can be the title, the author, the different scripts, JavaScripts, CSS files, and all the other things that aren't necessarily immediately seen from a web page that can exist in the header. All the other content is generated using those tags, and it is basically the bare minimum to have a web application. You need HTML. Without HTML, you don't have anything else. But by itself, HTML is just the bones. Essentially, if you have a person, HTML is just a skeleton, and you won't know the interactivity, the looks and feel of a website without CSS and JavaScript. So I'll continue on to CSS. CSS is the clothes of a person. It's kind of like the paint on a building, or the furniture or the building design. Essentially, CSS modifies all of those tags that I mentioned for HTML. It's going to be able to change things such as colors, fonts, layouts, images, and using CSS and HTML alone, you can create a very pretty website without using anything else. Essentially, CSS is there to make the website look better and make it prettier. Without CSS, we wouldn't have anything like, changing the color of a button, or if you hover over an element on the HTML page, being able to change how things look based on whether or not something is being hovered or is clicked or has a URL or things like that. So for example, on a nav bar, if you have clicked on a certain page and you want the nav bar to indicate that the page you are on currently is highlighted in the nav bar, you can use CSS for that. So if a URL ends in something, you can make that something be highlighted orange, for example, on the nav bar. Or it could be underlined, for example. So without CSS, you don't have all the styling of HTML. The next part is JavaScript. And JavaScript is probably the most important part of any web application. JavaScript is being run on the browser client side and server side. But most importantly, we'll talk about client side first. When a browser is rendering content, it is using JavaScript to render the content and make changes based on what code you have provided. JavaScript has a lot of different ways it can manipulate both HTML and CSS. JavaScript can also be used to fetch data. You can use asynchronous fetching to fetch data from different pages or websites. JavaScript can also be used to pull dynamic content that isn't initially there on the HTML page by itself. So the JavaScript can interact with the server and the backend and fetch content to pull into HTML, written as HTML and CSS, and dynamically display it onto a web page. For example, if you are trying to fetch information from a search, for example, JavaScript will be able to take the search function, send the parameters to the backend, get the data, bring it back, and then render content using HTML and CSS on the client side. JavaScript is very powerful and it can be used to update events, functions. It can be used to update the elements, the DOM on the HTML. And so it is a very powerful tool that is being run purely client side on the web browser. Next, we have Node and Express. Node and Express work together on the server to be able to essentially be the gears that turn the car. It's like the engine. It's the gears that and the engine that is able to turn behind the scenes to be able to generate content and render content for people on their web browsers. Using Node, you can install different packages and different things to be able to connect to different parts, for example, to the database. You can install the MongoDB driver, and using Express, you can connect to MongoDB and fetch data that way. Express is essentially the backend framework that handles the request and response. It's able to make API calls, it's able to route different URLs to the right HTML pages. It's able to connect to MongoDB, as I said before. And it's that routing that is the most powerful part of Express to be able to have different things require different backend server files to be able to run web applications. It's essentially kind of like a post office. It gets a request, it takes your mail, and then it points it in the right direction. And then we have MongoDB. MongoDB is a database. It is where we are storing, as I mentioned before, it's where we are storing our information. It's where we are getting our information back. And it's using a binary JSON records to be able to store and be very flexible in its use. MongoDB is not the only DB you can use. As I mentioned before, you can use MySQL, SQLite, Postgres, or any other database. But MongoDB tends to be the most popular database for web applications because of its speed and efficiency. And like I said before, we're using Node, Express, and Mongo essentially on the backend server side to be able to grab all of this information and put it out client side to be able to render on the client's machine. MongoDB can essentially be seen as like a filing cabinet. You store all these loose paper files, and you are essentially going there and retrieving a file directly, and it's acting like a file cabinet. The next part we have is React. React is the front-end library for web applications. So essentially, if we are trying to program in interactivity, look and feel of a website, and complexity, we can use React. React is able to manage asynchronous data. It's able to have parent and child prop data sending and back and forth, and it's able to handle front-end rendering. React is a very powerful tool. Again, it is not the only required tool to use. You can use Vue, you can use AngularJS, you can use Django. There are a lot of different options. So this others part is all the other parts that could replace Node, Mongo, Express, or React to be able to create a web application. But at its core, HTML, CSS, and JavaScript is essentially what's needed to create a website. But without HTML, there is basically no web application. So HTML is the most important part of any web application. Now I'm going to go into a deep dive of Express.js. Express.js is essentially what's running on the back end of the server to handle routing, API calls, database connections, and things like that. It's installed using Node.js, and essentially, because we have the same JavaScript programming language for the back end and the front end, we're able to keep a common, consistent language across the entire web application. Of course, if you're using a different stack, for example, PHP, you would be using two different languages for the front end and the back end, but Express is able to handle the routing and all the different things with JavaScript. So it allows for a cohesive unit when making web applications. Express.js is essentially a small and minimal framework that's able to handle routing. It is it's a simplistic, streamlining server development process, and so it's allowing a lot of different things to happen in the back end without compromising speed and efficiency. So the most important part to know is the request and response cycle. Basically, a client and a server is communicating with each other, and that communication method is through URLs. Express is able to handle those URL requests, make sure that all the routes, API calls, and all the different things are going to the right places and being connected to the right places in the back end server, and it's able to match those requests and serve you exactly what you want to see on the client side. So the routes can handle the middleware, where essentially it's handling, okay, I need to grab this back end portion of the web application, and I'm going to show you and point to the right direction for where the front end has its HTML and JavaScript and CSS in order to handle all of the interaction from both the client and server side. Essentially, like I mentioned before, we're going to have Express basically be the post office. You have letters coming in, and Express makes sure the letter goes to the right place. Now, there are four main methods for routing. There's get routes, post routes, and put routes, and delete routes. Each route has its important function. Get routes are used to request or fetch data from the server. Post routes are just used to send new data to the server. Put routes are used to send new data to the server, essentially to update. And delete is able to delete a resource from the server. Now, the middleware is where it's the most important part. Essentially, when a URL comes in and says /home, it's essentially routing /home to the right place. Express will be able to understand that home needs authentication, or it needs to go to and find the users then it can route all those API calls as well, along with pointing to the right direction to go to home, for example. It can handle authentication and change the content of the web page based on, okay, this person is logged in. I need to show them this version versus another version where the person is not logged in. Essentially, it can handle the mapping of the logic of the web application. Um, middle Because of the middleware functionality of Express, it's able to allow for a lot of different things like authentication, cookies, session, and error handling, and allows for all this versatility for all web applications. Essentially, Express using routes and middleware is handling most of the logic that you use to handle the complexity and the interactivity of a website. For example, when we're serving static files or JSON information or API, RESTful APIs, Express excels at this. It's able to serve static files, it's able to parse JSON very well, it's able to uh, handle creation of a RESTful API using those calls that I mentioned before, and it's able to route all the things in a well constructed RESTful API. Another important part of Express.js is that it allows connection to MongoDB. MongoDB is a database that stores binary JSONs. Because of this, Express is able to very quickly fetch data. It's able to update data on MongoDB. It's able to delete. And essentially, using MongoDB, we can have our CRUD operations. We can create, remove, update, or delete. And so, create, retrieve, update, and delete. And so, essentially, all CRUD operations can be handled with Express and using MongoDB. And MongoDB is really great at being a great source of a database that is very fast and very scalable. So the most important parts for Express as a summary is that it can handle routing, it can handle middleware, and it can handle database integration. In addition to serving web pages, as I said before, Express is essentially the backbone of the API. And the API is very important for web applications because it's where you're getting all of your information, it's getting all of the interactivity, it's able to fetch and update things. And it essentially, when we're creating a RESTful API, it's able to create something that follows a predictable pattern. And using Express, we're making a very consistent web application that follows very easy to follow structure, logic, and understanding. Uh, Express is very useful in handling um, lots of requests at the same time because it's very lightweight, and it's also able to handle errors and things like that for websites because if a URL that's requested is not there, has been updated to a different URL, it is not a valid URL, and things like that. It can also handle that kind of routing behind the scenes so that a incorrect URL just doesn't go to a dead page. It's able to correctly handle, take you to different pages or take you to an error page or things like that so that you are able to properly handle all client requests on the server. Now we're going to go into a brief coding example of how to implement Express. Now we will begin a real coding example to get started with Express. It's just going to be a very simple Express web application. To get started, we're going to do npm init. Just for simplicity, we're going to say yes to everything. It's going to create a package.json, and we're going to do npm install express. If we look inside here, we'll see express. Well, full.js. And here we'll do const express wire express. We're coding in JavaScript. Const app express. Then we'll get our first route. We'll say app.get. Our first route is just going to be for the slash with nothing at the end. So this would be your basic index HTML, for example. Hello world. And we will listen on port 3000. And that is just for local development. And just for clarity that things are running, 1000, we'll mention this here. Then we can define the different routing that we were mentioned before. So for example, we can get app get slash users request, and we will, instead of serving URLs, we're just going to send data, just going to send text to make it very simple so that we're not creating a full web stack, but just to give you an idea of what users will do for running Express. Have a post example. Users. And we'll have a put example. And we'll have a delete example. And so essentially what we have here is when a URL is being requested to the server from the client, essentially when the slash is being requested, we're sending hello world. When users are being requested, this is what's being sent. And we have the routes that we mentioned before. There are get, post, put, and delete. And essentially you're able to use this to handle the routing for all of your web application needs. Now, to get this showing on a browser, I've changed the port number to 8080 in this app lesson, and you run it by going node space example.js as we've done so far. Now, for example, the base URL, which is this slash here, app.get, it is sending hello world, and of course, when we go to localhost 8080, we can see hello world. If we go to local 80/users, we'll get all users. Now, get is the very basic functionality for requesting a URL. The base is just get. Post, put, and delete are special ways to do that. And that would require a little bit more, but so we won't show those examples directly. But if we put app.get slash new example, and we save and we rerun Node.js and we go to this new URL, new example, we will get new example. So that's a brief tutorial on how to use Express and how to use routing. And that should be the end for the midterm evaluation. Thank you for watching. Please let me know if you've learned anything interesting or anything new, and feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions about web development and Express or anything else in the future. Thank you for watching.